He had 10 seconds to choose between his life and his unit. The grenade rolled across the frozen ground of Korea, December 1950. Private First Class. Michael Thompson watched it bounce once, twice, coming to rest between him and 12 men huddled in a foxhole. Time didn't slow down like they say in the movies, it accelerated. His mind calculated distances, trajectories, the blast radius he'd studied in basic training. 9 seconds now, maybe 8. The chosen reservoir stretched behind them, a sheet of ice that had already claimed more Marines than enemy bullets. They'd been retreating for days, what the brass called advancing in a different direction. The Chinese had come in waves the night before, tens of thousands streaming down from the mountains, bugles screaming, the temperature 30 below zero. 7 seconds. Thompson had enlisted straight out of high school in Detroit. His mother had cried at the train station, pressing a small Bible into his hands. "Come back to me," she'd whispered. He'd promised he would. That was before he understood that some promises are made to be broken. Before he learned that heroism isn't a choice you make with time to think. It's what happens when your body moves before your mind can stop it. The other men hadn't seen the grenade yet. Corporal Davis was trying to light a cigarette with frozen fingers. Young Patterson, barely 18, was writing what might be his last letter home. Good men. Men with families. Men with futures. 5 seconds. In his pocket, Thompson carried a photograph of Betty, his girl back home. They were supposed to marry in the spring. She'd written him every week since he shipped out. Her letters smelling faintly of lavender, telling him about the new job at the factory, about how she was saving money for their wedding. 3 seconds. The mathematics of sacrifice are simple and terrible. 1 life for 12. Any fool could do that calculation. But mathematics don't account for the weight of a decision, for the way your whole existence compresses into a single moment of choice. 2 seconds. Thompson moved. The thing about heroism is that it's often mistaken for fearlessness. But Thompson was terrified as he threw himself onto that grenade, terrified of the pain that was coming, terrified of the darkness, terrified of leaving his mother alone, of never seeing Betty again, of dying at 20 years old in a country whose name he could barely pronounce. The blast should have killed him instantly, should have. But the human body is both more fragile and more resilient than we imagine. The grenade was Chinese-made, old, perhaps defective, or perhaps God, if he was watching that frozen hellscape, decided to write a different ending to this story. The explosion tore through Thompson's body armor, shredded his jacket, drove shrapnel deep into his flesh, but his heart kept beating. Corporal Davis was the first to reach him. "Medic!" The scream echoed across the valley, bouncing off mountains that had witnessed 1,000 years of warfare. They turned Thompson over gently, afraid of what they'd find. Blood was already freezing on the ground, turning to red crystals that sparkled in the weak morning sun. Did I get it?" Thompson whispered. "You got it, Mike. You got it." The medic, a kid from Iowa named Henderson, worked with hands that shook not from cold but from the magnitude of what he was seeing. He'd treated gunshot wounds, frostbite, burns from white phosphorus. But this was different. This was a man who had chosen to become a human shield, who had traded his future for theirs. Sergeant Mills made the call. "We carry him." "Sarge, that's suicide." The Chinese, "We carry him." And so began one of the most extraordinary rescues of the Korean War. 12 men who had just watched their brother throw himself on death for them refused to let death win. They fashioned a stretcher from rifles and jackets. They took turns carrying Thompson through snow that came up to their knees, through mountain passes where one false step meant a 500-foot fall. For 6 hours they carried him, 6 hours through hell. Thompson drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes crying out for his mother, sometimes trying to joke with the men to keep their spirits up. "Hey, Patterson," he'd whisper, "make sure you tell Betty I kept my hair regulation length." They laughed through their tears, these hard men who'd seen too much, carrying their broken brother toward a salvation they weren't sure existed. The human capacity for endurance reveals itself in extremity. What those 12 men did over the next 6 hours defied every manual, every tactical assessment, every reasonable calculation of survival. They should have left Thompson. Military logic demanded it: save the many, sacrifice the one. But logic had died the moment Thompson jumped on that grenade. They moved through a landscape that belonged more to nightmare than to Earth. The Chosin Reservoir campaign would go down as one of the most brutal in American military history. Temperatures that turned weapons into clubs when oil froze, Chinese forces that attacked in human waves, accepting catastrophic losses to overwhelm American positions. Men's feet turned black in their boots, fingers snapped off like twigs. Through this apocalypse, they carried Michael Thompson. Private Patterson took point, barely old enough to shave but aged decades in weeks. He'd lied about his age to enlist, driven by the same patriotic fever that had gripped the nation after World War II. Behind him, 4 men at a time bore the stretcher, rotating every 10 minutes to prevent exhaustion. The others formed a protective perimeter, weapons ready. Thompson's blood left a trail in the snow. Henderson had done what he could, but the human body holds only so much blood, and Thompson was leaving his across the frozen mountains of North Korea. Each time they stopped to rest, Henderson checked the bandages, injected more morphine, whispered lies about how good Thompson looked. "Tell me about Betty," Mills said during one rest, kneeling beside Thompson in the snow. Thompson's eyes focused with effort. She's got these green eyes, Sarge, like spring grass. And when she laughs, it's like music. I was gonna build her a house with a porch. Mills gripped Thompson's hand. "You're still gonna build that house, Mike. You hear me?" They reached the ridge overlooking the American lines just as the Chinese launched another assault. Thousands of them pouring down the mountainsides, their quilted uniforms making them look like an avalanche of humanity. The American perimeter was collapsing. Artillery fire walked up the valley, and there, caught between their own lines and the enemy, 13 Marines faced an impossible choice. They could wait out the battle hidden among the rocks, but Thompson didn't have time to wait. Or they could try to cross 500 yards of open ground while 2 armies tried to annihilate each other. It was suicide. It was their only chance. They ran. 500 yards. In peacetime, a brief jog. In war, an eternity. They moved in a tight formation, 4 men carrying Thompson, the others providing covering fire. The first 100 yards, they were invisible, 2 armies too focused on killing each other to notice 13 men racing between them. Then a Chinese machine gunner spotted them. Bullets cracked overhead. Snow erupted around their feet. Patterson went down, his left shoulder blown open. But he got back up, rifle switching to his right hand, still firing, still moving. Because that's what you did. You moved forward. Always forward. Behind them, Chinese soldiers were breaking through American lines. Ahead, American artillery was danger close, shells impacting so near they could feel the heat 200 yards. Mills spotted a shallow depression, probably carved by snowmelt in some long-ago spring. They dove into it as machine gun fire swept the ground they'd just crossed. For a moment, they could breathe. Henderson was all over Thompson, checking vitals, adjusting bandages. The kid from Detroit was barely conscious now, his skin the color of old paper, his breathing shallow and rapid. "We gotta move," Mills said. "Now." 300 yards. A mortar round landed 20 feet away. The explosion lifted Davis off his feet, slammed him into the frozen ground. When he tried to stand, his left leg wouldn't work. Broken, maybe shattered. He looked at the others, saw the calculation in their eyes. "Go," he said. "I'll cover you." Like hell. Patterson, bleeding from his shoulder, grabbed Davis under one arm. Another Marine took the other side. Now they were carrying 2 wounded, their formation ragged, their speed cut in half. 400 yards. They could see American troops now, dug into positions along a ridgeline. See medics moving between foxholes. See the aid station, a collection of tents marked with red crosses. Salvation visible but not yet reached. The Chinese attack was intensifying. American lines were bending. Thompson's eyes opened. Through the haze of morphine and blood loss, he saw his brothers struggling, saw Davis being dragged, saw Patterson's blood staining the snow. "Leave me." Mills leaned close. "Not a chance, Marine. We don't leave brothers behind. The last 100 yards took forever." Each step an act of will. Chinese mortars walked toward them. American covering fire swept over their heads, an artillery shell impacted behind them. The concussion wave hit like a giant's fist, throwing them forward. American troops were rushing out to help now. Medics with stretchers, riflemen laying down suppressing fire. They crossed into American lines as the Chinese assault reached its crescendo. They had made it. All 13. Alive. The aid station was chaos orchestrated. Wounded men lay in rows on the frozen ground, medics and doctors moving between them with the focused intensity of men fighting death itself. They'd converted a Buddhist temple into an operating theater, its ancient walls now witnessing a different kind of suffering. They rushed Thompson straight into surgery. A doctor from Chicago, Captain Martinez, took one look and shook his head. "How is he still alive?" "He's a Marine," Mills answered, as if that explained everything. For 3 hours, Martinez and his team worked on Thompson. They pulled out 17 pieces of shrapnel, some the size of quarters, some mere slivers that had traveled through muscle and tissue like deadly seeds. They transfused blood donated by his brothers, who lined up despite their own wounds. Patterson gave blood until he passed out. Davis, his leg in a splint, dragged himself to the donation area. Outside the temple, the battle for Chosin Reservoir raged on. History would record it as a strategic withdrawal, a fighting retreat that saved the 1st Marine Division from annihilation. But for the men in that aid station, history was secondary to the immediate struggle. The human body's will to live is a force that medical science still doesn't fully understand. By every measure, Thompson should have died on that frozen ground, should have died during the 6-hour carry, should have died on the operating table as his heart stopped twice and had to be massaged back to life. But something in Michael Thompson refused to quit. He survived the surgery. Martinez emerged exhausted, blood on his surgical gown, disbelief in his eyes. He's stable. For now. But he needs to be evacuated to Japan immediately. The problem was evacuation. The airstrip at Hagururi was under constant fire. Transport planes landed, loaded wounded, and took off through corridors of tracer fire and exploding shells. It was Russian roulette with aircraft. They loaded him onto a C-47 the next morning. Mills climbed aboard, refusing to leave Thompson's side. As the plane lifted off, Chinese artillery bracketed the runway. Shells exploded where they'd been seconds before. The flight to Japan took 5 hours through turbulent winter skies. Thompson drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling for his mother, sometimes trying to joke with Mills. "Hey, Sarge, did I ever tell you, Betty makes the best apple pie?" "No, Mike, tell me about it." And Thompson did, his voice weak but determined, painting word pictures of Sunday dinners and baseball games, of all the gloriously ordinary things that make up a life, the things men fight for, the things that matter when everything else falls away. Tokyo Army Hospital was a world away from the frozen hell of Korea. Clean sheets, hot food, nurses who spoke in soft voices and smelled of soap instead of cordite. For men coming from combat, it was jarring. This return to civilization. Thompson underwent 6 more surgeries over 3 weeks. Japanese doctors working alongside American medical teams marveled at the extent of his injuries and his survival. Each day was a victory. Each small improvement, sitting up, eating solid food, making jokes with the nurses. A miracle earned through suffering. Mills stayed by his side, writing letters to Thompson's mother when Mike was too weak to hold a pen. The sergeant became a bridge between Thompson and home, carrying messages back and forth, maintaining the connections that gave a man reason to fight through another day of pain. The letters from Betty came daily, sometimes 2 or 3 at once as mail caught up with troop movements. Mills would read them aloud when Thompson was too tired to focus on the words. They painted a picture of life continuing in Detroit. Snow on the streets, Christmas decorations going up, her job at the factory where she was promoted to shift supervisor. "Dear Michael," one letter began, "I dreamed about you last night. We were dancing at our wedding and you were wearing your dress blues and everyone was crying because you looked so handsome. I woke up and reached for you and for just a moment I forgot you were gone. But then I remembered you're coming home, you promised, and you always keep your promises." Thompson cried when Mills read that one. Not from pain, but from the weight of almost breaking that promise. Word of Thompson's actions had traveled up the chain of command. A colonel from division came to the hospital, stood at attention beside the bed of a PFC who'd redefined the meaning of sacrifice. There was talk of medals, of recognition, of the kind of honors reserved for those who go beyond duty into the realm of the extraordinary. But Thompson wasn't thinking about medals. He was thinking about walking again, about building that house with a porch, about keeping promises that had almost been shattered by Chinese steel. The other men from his unit had been scattered. Some evacuated with wounds, others returned to combat as the Marines fought their way out of the Chosin trap. But they wrote to him, these brothers bound by frozen blood. Patterson sent a letter that said simply, "You jumped on death for us. We carried you through hell. That makes us even, right? Wrong. We owe you forever." Recovery isn't linear. There were setbacks, days when infection spiked Thompson's fever, when doctors whispered in corners about amputation. The human body can endure incredible trauma, but it extracts a price. Thompson would carry shrapnel in his body for the rest of his life, metal fragments too deep or too dangerous to remove. But he was alive. Against every odd, every medical probability, every cold calculation of combat mathematics, Michael Thompson was alive. Spring came to Tokyo while Thompson learned to walk again. Cherry blossoms bloomed outside the hospital windows, their pale pink petals drifting on warm breezes. Physical therapy was its own kind of battlefield. Muscles atrophied from weeks in bed screamed protest. Scar tissue pulled with every movement. The simple act of standing required will that had carried him through combat. The physical therapist was a no-nonsense Army nurse named Lieutenant Sarah Coleman. She'd seen hundreds of men broken by war, had learned that healing required both compassion and steel. "Pain is just weakness leaving the body," she'd tell Thompson as he struggled through exercises that once would have been effortless. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I left all my weakness on a mountain in Korea." "Then this should be easy, Marine." It wasn't easy. Nothing about coming back from the dead is easy. Thompson's body had been fundamentally altered by the grenade. Nerve damage made his left side unpredictable. Some days, his leg would simply refuse to bear weight. Other days, phantom pains would shoot through him like electricity. His nervous system confused by trauma it couldn't forget. But Michael Thompson had jumped on a grenade for his brothers. He'd survived being carried through hell. He'd lived when medical science said he should die. Learning to walk again? That was just another impossible thing to add to the list. Weeks turned to months. Thompson progressed from wheelchair to crutches to cane, each milestone celebrated with letters to Betty, to his mother, to the men who'd carried him. He was relearning not just how to walk, but how to be human again, how to exist in a world where grenades didn't fall from the sky, where the enemy wasn't hiding behind every ridge. The war in Korea ground on without him. His unit had been rotated home, most of the men who'd carried him now safely back in the States. They kept in touch, these brothers forged in ice and blood. Some were struggling with their own demons. The cost of war isn't always visible, isn't always physical. Men who'd faced Chinese armies without flinching found themselves unable to face crowded rooms, loud noises, the ordinary chaos of civilian life. Mills visited whenever he could, bringing news from the unit, messages from men too proud to write but not too proud to ask about the kid who'd saved their lives. The sergeant was being promoted, reluctantly accepting recognition for the rescue mission. "It wasn't me," he'd tell anyone who'd listen. "It was all of us." And it started with Thompson. By summer, Thompson could walk unassisted for short distances. The doctors called it miraculous. The nurses called it stubborn Marine determination. Thompson called it keeping a promise. He had a girl to marry, a house to build, a life to live. Every painful step was a step toward home. The medal ceremony happened on a humid Tokyo morning in August. They'd wanted to wait until Thompson could stand on his own. And he did, though his legs shook with the effort. The Medal of Honor, the nation's highest recognition for valor, hung heavy around his neck. But heavier still was the knowledge of what it represented, the 10 seconds that had changed everything, the choice that had defined him. "You're a hero," the general said. "No, sir," Thompson replied. "I just didn't want my brothers to die." Sometimes heroism is that simple, and that complicated. The flight home took 23 hours, island hopping across the Pacific, each landing bringing Thompson closer to a life he'd almost lost, a future he'd almost traded for 10 seconds of sacrifice. Other wounded men filled the plane, each carrying their own stories of survival, their own prices paid in flesh and blood and innocence. Thompson stared out the window at endless ocean, thinking about the mathematics of war. 13 men had walked into that valley. 13 had walked out. In the brutal calculus of combat, that was a miracle, but miracles, he was learning, came with interest. Every man who'd carried him would carry that day forever. Every family spared grief would never know how close they'd come to loss. San Francisco materialized out of morning fog like a dream. American soil. Home soil. The wounded were transferred to military hospitals for final processing. But Thompson's war was over. Honorably discharged, decorated, free to build that life he'd protected with his body. Free to keep promises almost broken. Mills was there to see him off. The sergeant, now a platoon leader, had requested leave to ensure Thompson made it home. One last mission for the man who'd defined what brotherhood meant. They stood at the train station, two Marines who'd seen the worst of humanity and the best of it, often in the same moment. "You saved us all," Mills said quietly. "You carried me home," Thompson replied. "We're even." But they both knew the ledger of such things could never truly balance. Some debts transcend repayment. Some bonds transcend time. The train to Detroit took 3 days. Thompson watched America roll past his window. Mountains and plains, cities and farmland, a nation at peace that barely understood the war its sons were fighting half a world away. He practiced walking the narrow aisles, building strength, refusing to arrive home on crutches. Pride, perhaps. Or simply the determination to walk into Betty's arms under his own power. His mother was waiting at the station. She'd aged years in months, her hair more gray than he remembered, lines carved by worry and sleepless nights. When she saw him, she broke down completely. This strong woman who'd raised him alone after his father died, who'd sent her only son to war with a Bible and a prayer. "My boy," she whispered into his shoulder. "My boy came home." Betty stood behind her exactly as Thompson remembered, yet somehow more beautiful. Those green eyes he'd described to Mills in the frozen mountains of Korea. That smile that had pulled him through surgery, through therapy, through every impossible moment. She was wearing the yellow dress he'd bought her before shipping out, the one she'd promised to wear when he came home. They didn't need words. Some reunions transcend language, exist in the space between heartbeats, in the electricity of souls reconnecting after being torn apart. He kissed her there on the platform while his mother cried and strangers applauded, this small moment of joy in a world that had seen too much sorrow. "You kept your promise," Betty whispered. "Almost didn't," Thompson admitted. "But you did. That's all that matters." The local newspaper wanted to do a story. The mayor wanted to throw a parade. The American Legion wanted him to speak at their meeting. Thompson declined them all. He'd had enough of being a hero. He just wanted to be Michael Thompson again. Just wanted to build that house with a porch, marry that girl with green eyes, live that gloriously ordinary life he'd almost thrown away. But some things you carry forever, whether you want to or not. The nightmares started his 3rd week home. Always the same. The grenade rolling across frozen ground, 10 seconds ticking down. But in the dreams, he was too slow. The explosion took his brothers, left him alone in the snow, surrounded by bodies and silence. He'd wake gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, phantom pains shooting through scars that would never fully heal. Betty learned to recognize the signs. The way his hands would shake before a storm, barometric pressure changes triggering memories of artillery. The way he'd go silent at unexpected loud noises. The way he'd count men in any room he entered. Old habits of survival that wouldn't die. She never complained, this woman who'd waited, who'd believed. She simply loved him through it, understanding that the man who came home wasn't quite the same as the one who'd left. They married in the spring, exactly 1 year after he'd promised. A small ceremony, just family and the men from his unit who could make it. Mills was his best man, Patterson and Davis among his groomsmen. The others sent letters, telegrams, gifts. 13 men bound forever by frozen blood and impossible choices. Thompson got a job at the Ford plant, honest work that paid enough to start saving for that house. He walked to work each day, a slight limp the only visible reminder of his sacrifice. The shrapnel still in his body would set off metal detectors, would ache when weather changed, would occasionally work its way to the surface. Small pieces of that Chinese grenade emerging years later like memories made manifest, but he was building something, a life, a future. The things he'd almost traded for 10 seconds of heroism. Patterson visited in the summer, his shoulder healed but his eyes carrying shadows that hadn't been there before. They sat on the porch Thompson had built with his own hands, drinking beer in comfortable silence, watching Betty tend her garden. Sometimes the best therapy is simply being with someone who understands, who was there, who knows the weight of survival. You ever think about it? Patterson asked eventually. Those 10 seconds? Every day. You ever regret it? Thompson considered the question. Thought about the pain, the surgeries, the nightmares. Thought about his brothers alive, building their own lives, raising their own families. Thought about Betty's laugh, his mother's tears of joy, this porch where he could sit and watch sunsets just like he'd promised. No, he said finally. I'd do it again. Yeah, Patterson agreed. Me too. That's the thing about sacrifice. It's not measured in what you lose, but in what you save. 13 men had walked out of that valley because one man chose his brothers over himself. Families remained whole. Children were born who might not have been. Lives continued that should have ended. The mathematics of heroism are complex, but the equation always balances. Years would pass. The Korean War would end in stalemate, its veterans returning to a nation eager to forget. But for those who were there, forgetting was impossible. They carried Korea in their bones, in their dreams, in the way they looked at snow and never saw beauty without remembering blood. Thompson would live to see his children born, would teach them about sacrifice and service, about the bonds between those who face death together. He'd tell them about the 10 seconds that defined him, about the brothers who carried him home, about the debt that could never be repaid but must always be remembered. The medal would sit in a drawer, brought out only when his children asked, when they needed to understand that heroism isn't about being unafraid. It's about being terrified and acting anyway. 50 years later, they gathered again. Not all of them. Time had claimed some, as time always does. But those who remained came to Detroit, gray-haired now, bodies bent by age but spirits still strong. They came to dedicate a memorial, to remember a day when 13 Marines defied death in the frozen mountains of Korea. Thompson stood at the podium, Medal of Honor bright against his dark suit. Betty beside him, still beautiful, still the girl with green eyes who'd waited. His children and grandchildren in the audience, learning for the first time the full story of those 10 seconds, that 6-hour carry, that refusal to let a brother die. People ask me about heroism, Thompson said, his voice still strong despite the years. They want to know what makes someone jump on a grenade, but that's the wrong question. The real question is what makes 12 men carry a dying brother through hell? What makes them refuse to leave him behind when every logical reason says they should? He looked at Mills, at Patterson, at Davis, at the surviving men who'd been there, who'd shared that frozen brotherhood. The answer is love. Not the kind they write poems about, the kind forged in fear and blood and impossible choices. The kind that says your life matters more than mine. The kind that carries broken men through mountains because that's what brothers do. The audience was silent. Some cried. Some who'd never understood war began to grasp its true cost, not just in lives lost but in lives forever changed, in men who came home carrying invisible wounds that would never fully heal. They call me a hero for those 10 seconds, Thompson continued. But the real heroes are the men who carried me for 6 hours, who gave their blood to keep me alive, who fought through their own wounds to bring me home. Heroes aren't born. They're revealed in moments when ordinary men do extraordinary things for each other. After the ceremony, they gathered at Thompson's house. Old men now, sharing stories, memories, laughter that came easier with age. The nightmares had faded, though never disappeared. The scars remained but no longer defined them. They'd built lives, careers, families. They'd taken the gift Thompson had tried to give them, time, and used it well. As evening fell, they sat on that porch Thompson had built so many years ago, watching another sunset, understanding that this might be their last gathering. Time was running out, as time does. But what they'd shared, what they'd survived, what they'd proven about the human capacity for sacrifice and love, that would endure. You know what I learned in those 10 seconds? Thompson asked quietly. The others waited. That we don't get to choose how we die, but we do get to choose how we live, and if we're very lucky, we get to choose who we'll die for. He raised his beer. To brothers. To brothers, they echoed. And in that moment, on that porch in Detroit, 13 Marines were young again, young and afraid and brave and unbreakable, bound forever by 10 seconds and 6 hours, and a lifetime of understanding that some things matter more than living. Some things are worth dying for. Some men are worth saving. Some promises must be kept, no matter the cost. That's what makes us human. That's what makes us brothers. That's what turns ordinary men into heroes when the grenades start to fall. Like this video if it moved you. Subscribe to hear more untold stories of valor. Share your own family's military stories in the comments below. Because these stories matter, these sacrifices shaped our world. And as long as we remember them, these heroes never truly die. They live on in every act of selfless courage, in every refusal to abandon a brother, in every choice to put others before ourselves. They live on